Okay, so there was a time when I was completely indecisive on my political leanings, especially in regards to economics, which is rightly called the dismal science. I had become partially convinced by the plethora of neoliberal capitalist arguments. I was that person who believed that universal healthcare would be nice, but where would we ever get the money? I was under the impression that the rich and corporations were already taxed into oblivion, and that our welfare state was off the charts. In my defense, this was well over a decade ago, and my grasp of political discourse still came from switching back and forth between CNN's vapid talking heads and the well-oiled talking points machine that is Fox News. Income inequality was still a fairly new concept in the mainstream, and any mention of it was quickly swept under the rug by accusations of class warfare. In any case, after a few heated debates with a good friend of mine, who I had considered to be a naive left-winger, my interest was piqued. He had mentioned income inequality being worse in the United States than in other advanced countries. And that other advanced countries still maintained their old levels of unionization and had a higher standard of living. This seemed counterintuitive to me, so I began doing some research, which led me to a video where Paul Krugman talks about all of this in a speech about his then new book, The Conscience of a Liberal. After watching the video, which I am including at the end of this video, I ordered and eventually read his book, which is the first of the 4 on this list. Before I get started, I want to mention that I'm going to repeatedly state that certain things were counterintuitive to me because they were counterintuitive to me as a centrist who had bought into a well-funded list of neoliberal capitalist arguments. Nevertheless, even though the neoliberal capitalists have lost much if not most of their messaging dominance, it seems that even many progressives don't necessarily understand why they themselves are on the right side of these arguments, and are often unable to counter the long list of talking points when confronted with them. The books I am about to mention give you a proper framework to debunk the neo-libcap narrative. Some of this comes in the form of a list of arguments, but much of it simply gives you a proper context that will allow you to spot when neo-libcaps are inaccurately framing a topic. Also, I read these books some time ago, and these are just quick summaries and examples. But these books are a wealth of information and contain countless details that I can't possibly mention and don't even remember. Details that refute any alleged rebuttals to the books that I have encountered. Furthermore, I am only summarizing how they've changed my mind, or given me new insights regarding the left versus right paradigm. There is a lot more to each of these books. When I say neoliberal capitalist, I'm using the word liberal as it's generally used within the YouTube left-wing and progressive spheres. The book I'm about to refer to uses the word liberal in the traditional mainstream sense and is interchangeable with the words left-wing and progressive. Before we begin, don't forget to click or tap the subscribe button and notification bell icon. Are you ready?
Here we go!
Book number 1. The Conscience of a Liberal, by Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman's Conscience of a Liberal takes you through U.S. history and explains how the 20th century middle class was created by New Deal initiatives, as unionization rates grew, as did taxes on the wealthy and corporations. It will also explain how the middle class has eroded as these policies were rolled back. And best of all, Krugman explains the various ways right-wing pundits play hide the ball with this data, by using incorrect indicators like average incomes instead of median incomes. Or focusing on household incomes, which masks the increase in double-income households. That sort of thing. What is fascinating about all of this is that this is the America that conservatives are allegedly nostalgic for. Little do they seem to know that this middle-class America was created through high taxes on the wealthy and central planning. This has helped me convince those who tend to favor the neoliberal capitalist views over the mistaken belief that it was low taxes and free market fairy dust that created the 20th century middle class. The book also explains why it was possible to cut down programs that helped the poor here in the United States while this didn't happen in our sister Western countries. Here's a hint: it was race. The GOP did a masterful job in equating our social safety net with people of color allegedly abusing the system and wasting hard-earned tax dollars. Here is the infamous GOP strategist Lee Atwater explaining how this works.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this.
I won't hear.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like, forced busing, states' rights and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than Never Knew, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
Here is Ronald Reagan giving a speech on states' rights in an area where civil rights activists had been killed.
Today, and I know from our own experience in California when we reformed welfare, I know that one of the great tragedies of welfare in America today, and I don't believe the stereotype after what we did of people in need who are there simply because they prefer to be there. We found the overwhelming majority would like nothing better than to be out with jobs, with a future, and out here in the society with the rest of us. The trouble is, again, that bureaucracy has them so economically trapped that there's no way they can get away, and they're trapped because that bureaucracy needs them as a clientele to preserve the jobs of the bureaucrats themselves. I believe there are programs like that, programs like education, others that should be turned back to the states and the local communities with the tax sources to fund them, and let the people choose them. I believe in states' rights. I believe in people doing as much as they can for themselves at the community level and the private level. And I believe that we've distorted the balance of our government today by giving powers that were never intended in the Constitution to that federal establishment. And if I do get the job I'm looking for, I'm going to devote myself to trying to reorder those priorities and to restore to states and local communities those functions which properly belong there. I'm going to try also. I'm going to try to change federal regulations and a tax structure that has made this once great, powerful industrial giant in this land, in the world, now with a lower rate of productivity than any of the other industrial nations, with a lower rate of savings and investment on the part of our people, and put us back where we belong. Now I just want to conclude with a couple of words.
And here is a conversation between Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. Note the use of the word monkey.
And last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television as I did, to see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
Well, and then the tail wags the dog there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The tail wags the dog. I, for example, just had a call from Reagan, California, and he's been out there and so forth, and as you can imagine, there's strong feeling that we just shouldn't. As he said, he saw these cannibals on television last night, and he said they weren't even wearing shoes, and he says here the United States is going to submit its fate to that, and so forth and so on, and but that's typical of a reaction which is probably quite strong.
Book number 2. How Markets Fail, The Logic of Economic Calamities, by John Cassidy. So while the conscience of a liberal explains the what of economic history, How Markets Fail dives deeper into why the economic 101ism you hear in right-wing argument templates is wrong. Long story short, human beings aren't omniscient pieces of software logically reacting to changes in prices and tax rates. We are complicated and react with all sorts of mental shortcuts we've developed through evolution. It also dives into why regulations are necessary as well as into game theory topics, including the prisoner's dilemma. What stands out to me the most was his section on Daniel Kahneman's and Amos Tversky's findings, which essentially reinvented the way we think of economics. Well, at least for those doing serious economics and not stuck to outdated concepts either due to ideology or grift. For example, when confronted with complex information, we large-brained apes tend to hide behind mental shortcuts called heuristics. These include the representativeness heuristic, which is the tendency to generalize based on insufficient evidence. This is what leads people to assume that short-term trends will continue, and underrate the prospects of a reversal. Or the availability heuristic, which leads people to place too much emphasis on their own experience to evaluate something outside of their experience. For example, people being more fearful of dying from a terrorist attack than a car accident, thanks to the media they consume. Book number 3. 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, by Ha-Joon Chang. Mainly this book opened up my eyes to a new level of depth regarding the economy. For example, the neoliberal capitalists' arguments often assume businesses are monolithic entities that do what's best for themselves. And in doing so, the business, and everyone in it, wins. This is ridiculous, of course, and in fact, shareholders are generally looking to generate short-term profits, which may come at the expense of the longevity of the company, which in turn hurts workers. In other words, it makes no sense to regard businesses as individual units, where everyone either wins or loses in tandem. And those in place to make the big decisions, aren't necessarily doing it for the long-term viability of a company. Another counterintuitive argument in this book is how welfare states actually result in more dynamic economies as they provide a cushion and a second chance. This is actually quite intuitive when you consider business bankruptcy laws. Allowing for some cushion and the possibility of starting over encourages people to take chances. The reverse leads them to live in a scarcity mindset, and stick to safe routes which discourage risk-taking and innovation. This may be one of the many reasons that the United States is constantly outranked by countries with larger governments and more generous social safety nets in the Heritage Foundation's own Economic Freedom Index. Book number 4. End This Depression Now, by Paul Krugman. This was in many ways Krugman's follow-up to The Conscience of a Liberal, and updated to address many of the misconceptions that had followed the 2008 recession. During this time there was a call for austerity, when in fact, what the American economy needed was more stimulus spending. He addresses the myriad of arguments against more stimulus spending, including the inflation fears as presented by people, including gold bugs like Peter Schiff. This book is timely because, rest assured, given our economic conditions now, all of these arguments will reappear, especially if Joe Biden is president. No doubt, if Joe Biden is president, the GOP will once again begin concern trolling over the debt and deficit. They will look to gut social spending and ignore the fact that taxes on the wealthy and corporations are at record lows. So there you have it. These 4 books, more than any others, changed the way I think and led me to create content like this video. Also worth mentioning, if you don't already have a grounding in basic economics, don't worry. Pick up a copy of Charles Whelan's Naked Economics, Undressing the Dismal Science, and you'll have a better grasp than neoliberal capitalists repeating the standard templated economic 101ism. Alright, I hope this helps. Happy reading. But first, here is the Paul Krugman video that led me to buy his book, The Conscience of a Liberal.
Forward TV. The world is thinking.
Let me give you a few things that people may not be aware of. The first is that the middle-class society I grew up in did not evolve gradually. You might think that there was there was the era of the robber barons, and then gradually America turned into the America of Ozzie and Harriet, whatever, that it gradually evolved into this middle-class society. That is not what the data or the available stories tell us. What they tell us is, in fact, that as far as we can tell, the Gilded Age lasted right through the 1920s. America, on the eve of the New Deal, was very nearly as unequal as it had been in the 1890s. And that the middle-class, relatively egalitarian society was created in a very short period of time, between the late 1930s and the end of World War II. The economic historians call it the Great Compression, because the income differences got compressed. And it's as important a story about 20th century America as the Great Depression, which we all know about, though it's much less told. And you look at what happened, and it was the Roosevelt administration, through a whole set of policies, but all of them equalizing. Much higher tax rates on the wealthy, higher corporate tax rates, a pro-union organizing environment, so you had an explosion in union membership, tripling of the share of the workforce. the minimum wage, Social Security, unemployment insurance, all of these things. And then the process accelerated because during World War II, there were extensive government controls on the economy, which were used in a way that tended to equalize incomes. All this created a middle-class society in a period of not more than about 7 or 8 years. Now, you might have thought, well, okay, but this was all artificial, especially the stuff during the war, so it would go away as soon as peacetime returned, but it didn't. Turns out that once you create institutions, norms, expectations of a relatively equal society, it tends to persist. So the income distribution, this relatively middle-class society that was created by the New Deal, persisted for more than a generation after World War II. Then it started to come apart, and you see this dramatic increase in inequality, not quite as fast as the Great Compression, but this dramatic increase starting around 1980, which in itself is kind of an interesting date because that's Reagan comes to the White House. And it turns out that the increase in inequality in the United States is unique to the United States. So other advanced countries have not seen anything like it. The closest thing you can see to the U.S., to this unequalization that's taken place in the United States is in Britain during the Thatcher years, which again is itself a little bit revealing. And nothing remotely, you just look at the charts and we are off the charts in terms of this increase in inequality. And many of the things that we take for granted as, well, this is the way things work in the late 20th, early 21st century economy, turn out to be special to the U.S. So one example I like to use is the decline of the union movement. We all know that unions are outmoded and you can't, it's global competition and all that. Except, well, here's a comparison people don't know. In the 1960s, Canada, that's the country up there. They almost speak the same language, eh? But anyway, in the 1960s, Canada and the United States had roughly the same percentage of their workers in unions, about 30% in both countries. Today, Canada still has almost 30% of its workers in unions. In the United States, it's down to about 11%, and much less than that, it's in the private sector. It's heavily a public sector thing left. So the deunionization was not something that happened because of the global economy, because Canada faces the same global economy we do. It was something that happened here. And how did it happen? Well, when you look into it closely, you discover that it was political. Basically, Ronald Reagan, above all, though it started before him, declared open season for union busters. During the 1980s, about 1 in every 20 workers who voted for a union was illegally fired. And the reason, sure, we're less of an industrial society, but there's no inherent reason why giant service sector companies, the iconic corporation of the 60s was General Motors, the iconic corporation of today is Walmart. There's no inherent reason why those companies should not be unionized. In fact, similar enterprises are in the rest of the world, but because the shift to a service economy took place in an environment in which politicians, the dominant political forces, said it was okay to bust unions in the way that people had in the 1920s, we've had this dramatic decline in unionization in the United States. So it is not, and that in turn has all kinds of ramifications for the income distribution. So I can talk about it at some length, but there's a lot of reason to believe that politics has driven this dramatic increase in inequality. Sure, technology is there, globalization is there, but it is very largely political. I should say one more thing. There's a view on inequality that you hear all the time, which is, well, it's all about the increased demand for skills for education in the modern world economy. And there's no doubt something to that, but if you actually look at the numbers, the huge growth in disparities has not been between the college-educated and the non-college educated. Yes, people with college degrees have done better than people without, but most of the increase is among people with a lot of education. So that most dramatic statistic, high school teachers tend to have postgraduate degrees, and so do hedge fund managers. And as we all know, last year the highest paid hedge fund manager in the United States made an amount equal to the salaries of all 80,000 New York City school teachers for the next 3 years. So this is, it's not education that is driving this. It's not that simple.